Hello all. Today I'm going to show you how to make this growling sci-fi horror sound effect. That was a short snippet from the film A Million Stars Already Dead by Ben Moran. Ben was kind enough to let me use his film to showcase this sound. He's actually a filmmaker based in Ireland whose films are extremely watchable, so if you have some time, I'd recommend checking him out. I'll put links to where you can do so in the description below. Ben, I just want to say thank you for letting me use this film. It was the perfect fit for this sound. So without further delay, let's get stuck in and take a look at some sound design. Okay, so I'm going to try and take you step by step through everything I did to create this sound. I am watching this footage back, so my commentary is not being recorded at the same time as me actually creating this sound. So forgive me if there are any slight errors with how that works out. So to start off with then in Massive, I'm going to set each of the three oscillators to a sine wave by dragging the wavetable position knob all the way to the left. And then I'm going to pitch the first oscillator down by 1 octave, second oscillator down by 7 semitones, and the third oscillator is pitched down by 5 semitones. Each oscillator then has a slightly different volume, with oscillator 2 being a little bit louder than 1 and 3. And if you're using Massive, although this can be done with any synth, I'm just going to route everything through filter 1 because we're not going to be using filter 2 whatsoever for this sound. Filter 1 then is going to be a low pass filter with the cutoff set at around 25% and the resonance closer to 50%. Switching just to the voicing tab, just to quickly change the sound to monophonic, and also in the oscillator tab, this is where the glide is applied. We're looking at about 50% glide, and I'm also hitting the restart via gate button just to make sure that we get a consistent sound with every triggering of MIDI. Quickly looking at the modulation oscillator, there were two things we're going to be altering here, the phase modulation and the filter FM modulation. I'm first just going to pitch down the oscillator by 1 octave, and the phase modulation will be applied to oscillator 3, the filter FM to oscillator 1. After that, I just assigned some quick macros. So these are values that we could change later on more easily. Macro 1 is just to automate the cutoff frequency. So you can see I'm not using the full range there of the parameter, just a portion of it. I find that a little after halfway on the cutoff frequency with this sound doesn't really make too much of a difference. Macro number 2 is going to be used to modulate the phase, and we're putting that up to 100% modulation. And then macro number 3 we can use to modulate the FM of filter 1, only a small bit there. At the moment, you should be getting this kind of sound. You'll notice that particularly the phase modulation won't do anything drastic to the nature of the sound. It'll become much clearer why I did that later on after we've applied some external effects to this source sound. The final thing I think I did then here with the synthesis was to apply macros 4 and 5 to the inserts on Massive. Insert 1 we're changing to a parabolic shaper, and the macro is controlling the dry and wet of that with the drive at just over 50%. And then macro 5 is, insert 2 will then be a hard clipper. Again, macro 5 controlling the dry wet, and the drive is going to be a little under 50%. I After turning off all of the modules that we're not using then in Massive, it's time to start looking at what effects can be applied to this to try to achieve a much more aggressive sound. And the first protocol for doing that is to add quite a lot of saturation distortion. So there are two saturation plugins I'm going to use here. The first of these was WA Productions Helper Saturator. With this one, I just put the saturation all the way up, left the low and the high pass for, parameters as they were, and just changed the input and the output values. So the input I drove to the maximum, which is 24 decibels, and then the output I did the opposite, reduced it by 24 decibels. So in theory, we should be getting a relatively similar level coming out that we were having going in, but with a lot of that drive applied through the plugin itself. The second saturation plugin then was Softtube Saturation Knob. This is actually a free plugin. I'll leave a link in the description as to where you can go to get this. With this one, it's a single knob plugin, and I just turned it up to about 50%. This next step then has a drastic impact on the sound. I'm using here the OTT, which is a multi-band upwards-downwards compressor, the depth of which I'm setting to about 70%. And just to tame the middle and the high frequencies, I'm going to dial down both of those, the mid to about 25%, and the high, I think, was a little bit over that. Yeah, about sort of in the region of 40% maybe. Next up, I used channel EQ. Any parametric EQ would do here. There's a slight cut just at 20 Hertz, just to try and control any very, very low frequencies at this point. And then what I'm looking to do is notch out any frequencies that I think either need boosting or reducing. So in this case, I think I found frequencies around sort of the 120 mark, and I drew quite a sharp notch with quite a drastic boost to that frequency range. I think in the end, resulting around sort of 10 dB. In fact, higher than that. Yeah, 14 dB, 14.5 dB increase there at 120 Hertz. What I then went ahead and did was the opposite. I made quite a drastic cut just beyond that. So around the 220 mark, I'm putting in here a cut of 22.5 decibels. This achieves that kind of that scooped out sound, which is probably more common with a lot of bass noises, which, to be fair, this is not that dissimilar from that kind of sound. It's very much a bass synth noise, this. There's a few things that we do to make it a bit more cinematic, but in a sense it is very much something that I've created from genres like dubstep, drum and bass, that kind of thing. The last thing there was just a boost around the sort of the 3K region, just to bring out some of the high end, some of that kind of sparkle that's been brought about by the saturation distortion. To further increase that, then I employed a second OTT, this time quite drastically changing the sound again, making it much, much brighter. I didn't change any of the settings, just left them as default, and before then moving on to the next plugin, which with one of the last bits of distortion, this time using the Crush plugin, which is a bit crusher. Again, this is actually a free plugin, so I'll leave a link in the description for that as well for you. With the Crush plugin, settled on a drive of about 24%, and the same level when it came to the downsampling as well, about 24%, felt about right. All I did then was just mess around with the filter quickly to make sure that I was not leaving in any really nasty high end, but at the same time trying to retain as much of the high end as we could before that kind of classic downsampling, bit crushing, high frequency energy came through this filter. So it's just chopping that off at the top, but still trying to keep the sound as bright as possible. So we're really just having the distortion affect the mid and the low end, really. The last distortion plugin then was just to use Logic's stock overdrive, turn the tone all the way up, and left the drive at about 3 decibels. And this is the resulting sound so far. Everything sounded pretty good and pretty nasty. I then went to employ a second channel EQ. this time just to try and cut out some of the frequencies that I was hearing that were kind of in the lower mid-range, which I felt were just muddying the sound up and not really kind of benefiting the sound in any particular way. So it's quite a heavy notch cut there at 176 hertz. And again, that just contributes towards that kind of hollowed out sound. The next plugin I'm using then is Haiku, which is actually traditionally a kind of stereo spreading plugin amongst a few other things, I believe. Ordinarily what you would do is you'd set the crossover frequency and then you turn the mix knob up to increase the stereo spread amongst other things. As this sound at the moment though is just mono, it won't have any effect on the stereo spread. What I do use it for though is to add kind of to colour the high end a little bit, as you can hear here. Lastly then, in this chain we're looking at adding a low pass filter. And all I'm doing here is just drawing in the automation going from 0% to 100% and trying to time that in line with the glide that we had set on the massive synth itself. And so together, this is the sound we have so far. And then just to get rid of that click at the end, rather than having it shoot back down to 0 immediately, I'm just going to put in a very steep drop back from 100 to 0. But I say very steep, it's more gradual than an immediate drop, so it just gives a much smoother recline back down to 0. The last thing then to finish everything off on this chain was a channel EQ. I employed this just because I was hearing some frequencies in the mid-range that were kind of making the sound seem too present, too upfront. I'm looking here for a more cinematic sound, and I found that cutting, in this case around 850 hertz, quite a drastic cut of 7 dB, just helped me to achieve a more natural and cinematic tone, which didn't seem like it was in your face. So that scoop just helped me to tame that and to make everything sound a bit more cinematic. Having finished then the first line of effects, what I'm doing here now is just sending this signal to 3 different buses, and then having the 3 buses and the original track all grouped together again in a 4th bus where they're just mixed back together. Purpose of the 3 buses is simply to split the sound up and to affect it in 3 different ways. So with this sound, what I decided to do was to go for one delay bus, one typical sort of reverb bus, and then the third, or in this case, sorry, the first, as you can see here, I've labelled it as a reflect bus. What that's going to be is a much shorter reverb, like an early reflection type effect, which I'll show you now. So to create the early reflection, I'm going to be using a reverb plugin by Native Instruments called Roam, or Room. Not sure exactly how you say that one. And these are the settings that I dialed in. Resulting sound here is almost a bit like a chorus effect more than a reverb. You can't hear it because I've muted the source signal, but it is actually delayed as well. So the idea here being that this sound you're hearing is triggered a few milliseconds after the actual sound itself is initially heard. You'll be able to hear that when I mix all the sounds back together again. The next effect I put on this channel was a delay. I just used a simple preset. With this one, nothing fancy. I am using Logic Stock Delay Designer. I'm sure you can get a very similar result though with many other delay plugins out there. The final step then, and I do this with each of these 3 buses, is to apply a low cut and a high cut just to tame, in this case, the reverb, but also the delay later on as well. As a general rule, I tend to cut around 300 hertz, particularly with this sort of sound, because I do want to keep a lot of the body. I just don't want the low end so much to be bouncing around on delays and reverbs. The high cut aspect then, I tune differently to each of these 3 channels, as you'll see. Moving on then to the dedicated reverb bus. For this, again, same plugin, using Native Instruments Realm, and just turning the mix all the way up, and the rest of the settings you can see me adjusting here. With this one, I'm trying to just achieve a much more typical reverb effect. The idea being that this will be layered with the other bus sends underneath the original sound to give it some extra width and depth. You'll also notice that although I do amend the low cut and the high cut on the reverb itself, I still go ahead and use an EQ plugin just to dial in that 300 hertz low cut, and also a different value on the high cut, just fine-tuned each time. The reason I do that with Logic is it just helps me to keep track of each of the channels, because what Logic does is it puts a small thumbnail of the EQ at the top of each track, as you can see there, and that just helps me keep track of everything visually. The final bus here then, as I say, is going to be a delay. I'm using a plugin here called Microfuse by a company called Surreal Machines. It's a mix of delay and reverb. I tend to turn to this one when it comes to sound design if I'm looking for something a bit experimental. It just allows me to get some unusual kind of delays that I wouldn't sort of naturally come to if I were using Logic stock delay plugins or a number of other delay plugins. Again, with this one, just cutting everything beneath 300 hertz and then dialing in a high cut as well to taste. With the delay, keeping it a little bit higher this time, just to preserve some of those really, really late reflections. As you can hear here. As you can hear. I then just brought down the level on each of these 3 bus sends so that they're a bit more in keeping with the original sound and they're not too prominent. I don't want to change the nature of the original sound too much here. Like I said before, I'm just trying to increase the width and the depth a little bit. And I find that with these sorts of effects, less is more. It's more about adding a kind of a subconscious effect, not something that stands out too much, but something that you do pick up on without kind of realizing it. Obviously, for different environments and different applications, you could dial these back in higher. It's all down to your taste and obviously the project, the requirements of the project that you're working on as well. The next step then is another step of splitting the sound up again. So with this layout, bus 4 was used to mix the original sound with the reflect, reverb, and the delay buses. And then what I've done is I've routed it to 2 more buses. So 4 is now going to 5 and 6. There's no stereo out. It's just going to 5 and 6. And what I'm using then on these 2 channels is an EQ. And this is going to be a method for splitting the middle and side information. So in bus 5, I'm labeling that as mid only. So what I'm doing is applying an EQ, switching it to side only, and then bringing the level down to minus 24 decibels. So effectively only letting the side be affected by the EQ and then turning that side information right down. So on the mid channel, you're just left with the remaining mid information. And I'm doing the reverse on bus 6, I believe, which is labeled a side bus. On that one, it's again another EQ. This time we only want the EQ to process the mid information, and I'm bringing down that mid information by 24 decibels. Each channel, you'll notice, has 3 of those EQs. It's just to completely make sure they're all doing the same thing. It's just to completely make sure that I totally eradicate either the mid or the side information, depending on which way around you're looking at it. What this then allows me to do is to apply effects, and in this case I'm just going to apply effects to the side information, but it allows me to apply those effects independently without affecting any of the mid information. For the purposes of this part of the tutorial, I'm just applying a gain plugin to the very end of the chain just to turn things up, because the side was by its nature much quieter than the mid. So this is just so that I can hear what I'm doing, and then once I'm happy with the effect, as I've dialed it in, I'll get rid of that gain plugin again. So we start off with a flanger. At this point, I'll be honest, it was just complete experimentation. I wasn't sure what I was trying to get, but I knew that I wanted to kind of alter the side information to be a little bit different and kind of a little bit more warbly, if you like. So the way I did that was with a flanger, and then also using a modulation delay as well. With both these plugins, it was just a case of experimenting with all the different parameters until I came up with something that was not drastically different, but a little bit interesting, and something I was happy with, basically. You can see that in this particular case, both these plugins created this more science fiction feeling side information. So rather than just having the dry reverb effect, so to speak, it was this amount of modulation on both the modulation delay and the flanger, just allow me to get that kind of science fiction element coming through a little bit more, but still remaining quite subtle with that. So then just taking off the gain, and you can hear what everything sounds like together now. I'm then just going to send both the mid and side buses to a final mix bus, And this is where I'll just apply a little bit more processing to bring everything together before sending it out and bouncing it all down. First step then here is to apply an EQ. With this, if I remember correctly, I just took a few cuts out here and there where I felt it was needed. My kind of approach here is just to smooth out any areas that stand out too much. Going back to what I was saying at the start, I want to keep that cinematic feel, and part of that is maintaining, I think, like a sort of a scooped out type sound. So any majorly offending frequencies here were cut. Nothing too drastic though. After I was happy with the EQ settings, I just applied some simple compression and some limiting, nothing too fancy. With the compression, I was aiming for a maximum reduction of about 3 decibels, just to try and tame some of the higher peaking areas of the signal. And then with the limiting, I just changed the output level to minus 0.3 decibels, and drove the gain to a point where it was just touching the ceiling, just triggering the limiter. A bit more of a safety net more than anything really with this kind of sound, but also trying to get as much out of it as I could, because obviously we want this sound to be as large as possible. Finally then, if I come back to massive, you should be able to see now the value of those macros we punched in earlier on. If I just change some of these, you can hear how drastically this now changes the sound. The phase in particular produces a very different kind of alarm sound. Okay, and that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like down below. And if you've got any questions or comments or even requests, feel free to drop them in the comments down below as well. And I'll try to respond as soon as I can. Hope you found it useful. Thanks again to Ben for letting me use his video at the start. And I'll see you next time.